We have the inflation numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics that came out today for the month of June. And as an economist, I want to walk you through these numbers because the story that these numbers tell is a lot different than the story we have seen over the last several months. So in June, if we look at the prices of overall goods, inflation fell by 0.4 percentage points. This means that year over year inflation has grown by about 3.5%, which is a decrease compared to the rate of 4.2% in May of 2026. Now, what is causing prices to fall? Well, the vast majority of this decline is caused by the falling price of energy. Energy as a whole in the month of June declined by 5.7%. This has been fueled mostly by a fall in both gasoline as well as fuel oil, and also a decline in electricity. Now, when we talk about inflation over here, we always like to look at both inflation with the cost of food and energy and without the cost of food and energy, because food and energy tend to be pretty volatile, as we can see in this particular month, where inflation for energy declined by almost 6%. So if we look at just inflation without the cost of food and energy, we see that prices did not increase or decrease at all, right? The rate is about 0% in June, which means that the consumer price index without the cost of food and energy, right, what we call core CPI, has grown year over year by about 2.6%. Now, looking at these results just for the month of June, this is relatively good news, right? The rate of inflation year over year and in 1 month has started to come down, which is what we were looking for, because the rate of inflation in May was the highest it had been in 3 years. However, there's a real question of whether or not this inflation decline will persist in the following months. And that's because a lot of the decline in inflation we see in June was the result of a peace deal between the US and Iran in a discussion of the opening of the Strait of Hormuz, right? The rising gas prices that we saw over the last several months were due to an oil supply shock stemming from the closure of the strait, which we saw in the rising price of oil, which subsequently affected a lot of other costs, including gasoline prices, which topped out at about $4.50 per gallon in the month of May. In the month of June, the price of gasoline actually came down to a little under $4 a gallon. However, it's unclear whether this lower price that stemmed from news of a ceasefire will continue to persist, given the degrading talks between the US and the subsequent reclosure of the Strait of Hormuz. So there's just still a lot of volatility, right, in the energy market that could mean that this deflation, right, this decline in prices is short-lived. So we just have to kind of wait and see what happens, because as we know and as we've talked about before, fuel prices, right, and gas prices and oil prices, not only do they increase the price of energy as they've seen, but as we've seen in the 1970s, they can persist into other sectors of goods, mostly because, especially in the US, we use fuel to power trucks and transportation, and that all adds on to subsequent spillover costs for a wide variety of goods. Now, one last thing is that whenever I make videos about like this, I inevitably get comments that say, we can't trust the numbers. How can you trust the numbers? You're a naive person for trusting the numbers. And I have a pinned video on my profile talking about exactly this, and I still believe in those thoughts from December of 2025. What I will say in addition to that video is that there's not just one economist at the Bureau of Labor Statistics unilaterally rubber stamping certain numbers, right? The Bureau of Labor Statistics is comprised of hundreds of economists that use statistical methods to calculate what the CPI is. And I think that if there was someone all the way at the top that was essentially crossing things out and like writing other numbers or manipulating numbers that were different from what the economists at the Bureau were calculating, we would hear about that in the same way that we have heard from whistleblowers across multiple different federal agencies about things that are nefarious going on. Until we hear from experts who say that we should not trust the numbers, right? Economists who study labor and who are experts in this, I will continue to take the numbers at face value. Experts like Dr. Erica McEnteffer, who was the former commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, who was fired last year, she has gone on social media and has said multiple times that the numbers are reliable, again, because of the staff economists who stay for multiple administrations, who are the ones in charge of calculating those metrics. For me, that is my stance right now, and I am more than willing to change it if circumstances prove otherwise. But for now, that's all I got. As always, if you have any questions, let me know.